This week's episode of the TribCast is supported by former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, Antonio Garza. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the TribCast. I'm James Barragan. I'm here with women's health reporter Eleanor Klibanoff and our fearless leader, Matthew Watkins.
Hello, James.
And being beamed in from Washington, D.C., our D.C. reporter, politics guru, Matthew Choi. Matthew, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Matthew Choi and I have spent a lot of time together in the last 72 hours.
The Matthews.
That's right.
Well, we've got a lot to break down this week. This week's podcast is all about the second Trump administration, what that means for Texas, and trying to look ahead at what this new Trump administration is going to look like. But before we do that, guys, it's been a long week. A lot of D.C. stuff going on, a lot of speaker stuff going on here in the Texas legislature. Let's just check in. How are we doing? How are we doing in 2025? Our third weekend? Are we keeping our resolutions?
I mean, we are here, it should note, in a snowstorm. I mean, Austin has been a blizzard is upon us. There was almost a third of an inch, not quite, of snow on the ground. So I think I'm pretty cold and pretty excited. I love a good weather weirdness. So I'm doing great.
Yeah, as I think we mentioned in last week's podcast, I was up in D.C. for the inaugural ball and everything like that. My flight from Dallas to Austin got canceled yesterday. So I ended up having to rent a car and drive down I-35 in the sleet and snow. So
just
that was
to
very
make it
fun.
back for TribCast.
But I had to, it had nothing to do with my children.
No.
It was y'all that I wanted to see.
TribCast listeners are your children.
Exactly.
Yeah, they are your family. That is what matters. Mm-hmm.
Matthew, how are things going in D.C.? Are you keeping your New Year's resolutions?
I'm trying my best. I'm going to the gym. I'm staying healthy. It's a little over 20 degrees here, so it's positively, tropical. But yeah, things are great.
Very, very, very different perspective from us here.
It's all relative.
Okay, so let's get started. First, for the Matthews, and I don't know how we're going to do this since there's two Matthews here.
Just call us Choi and Watkins.
Okay. For the Matthews, you guys were both there in D.C. for the inauguration. Give us a breakdown. What was it like to be there in the city, just overall? And then also watching the event. What was the vibe? I'm sure you guys ran into a lot of Texas politicians who were there for this event.
Yeah, I will say one of the more surreal parts of the weekend was just being in a big city that's sort of traditionally viewed as one of those like liberal elite cities, and just to like look around and everyone is a Trump supporter. It was a little bit like backwards in that way, right? You normally don't associate, inner Washington D.C. with like being Trump's base, but I think, it was obviously a self-selecting crowd, like a lot of people who came specifically to see the inauguration. A lot of people, I think, disappointed to not actually get to witness the actual inauguration. And, I think a lot of kind of chatter about people's, inauguration tickets turning into kind of fancy commemorative bookmarks and everything like that. But that being said, still, I think a lot of excitement, a lot of sort of, people feeling people of a certain political persuasion feeling a lot of sort of relief to be kind of going back to a Republican administration, a Trump administration, and things like that. Matthew and I were a part of a sort of business leaders conference the day before the Texas inaugural ball. That was an interesting crowd too, because it's not necessarily your typical, MAGA, red hat wearing group as much as the sort of more like business alliance support for him. And that was interesting because I think there was a lot of sort of cautious optimism. I think a lot of support for Trump, a lot of support for his policies, a lot of excitement, but also some questions. And I think we could probably get into this a little bit later around things like tariff policy and what impact that's going to have on Texas businesses and things like that. So, Texas came out in full force, though. We all had our boots and bow ties on, and both among just like regular people and politicians, a lot of sort of representation up there in D.C. this week.
We get it, Matthew. You're important. You go to Boots and Bow Ties.
Yeah, the business leaders conference he was invited to as a business leader.
My favorite moment, I want to say, of the Boots and Bow Ties, as I spent pretty much the entire evening with Matthew and our events director, Matt Ewalt, as well, was we were in a certain room. And this will give you just a sense of like what that ball is like.
A ball.
And I look and I point and I go, "Oh, there he is." And Matthew goes, "Oh, who? Are you pointing to Brian Babin, U.S. Congressman Brian Babin?" And I was like, "No, actually, right behind him, it's the rapper Waka Flocka Flame." You know, it's
now I'm interested. I gotta be honest.
Do it with no hands.
Now I'm jealous.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And
I was
hey, they
not
were
jealous.
both jamming out, so universal vibes all around. It's a great time.
yeah.
Matthew Choi, how are things for you? What was the inauguration like?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most interesting kind of themes is that there's such a different mood relative to 2017. Back then, the Trump crowd was kind of thinking, did we seriously just win this thing? Oh my goodness. And, like a lot of the more traditional Republicans were thinking, oh, I wonder what this is going to look like. This is not kind of the typical Republican playbook. And there's a bit of hesitancy. This time, however, it was very much the idea of, we are so back, baby. It was very jubilant. They were very confident in themselves. And people really kind of knew much more what to expect this time. I think the business community was a bit more enthusiastic now because they've seen what a Trump presidency is like. So there's no longer that kind of uncertainty that gave them pause last time. And they knew that a lot of his policies were very friendly to a lot of business interests, particularly businesses that are quite important for Texas, like the oil and gas sector, also agriculture as well. So, it was just like absolutely jubilance around the Republican, the big Republican 10.
Matthew, I did want to ask about that because, as Matthew Watkins pointed out, it is seen as the swamp. It's seen as the liberal elite. And I wonder what sort of Democrats were feeling if you saw them walking around or if you got to talk to any of them. Because the New York Times had a great story about how the 2017 resistance has turned into the 2025 resignation. And in talking to a lot of Democrats, it does sort of feel that way. Or people who are not even Democrats, but just oppose Trump's way of doing things and his view of the world. But I wonder if you could give us any insight into that since you are in D.C. and live there.
Yeah, I mean, an important thing to note about 2016 was that there was a large sense of indignation on the part of Democrats because they did win the popular vote, remember? So, and already for a party that really doesn't, have much affection for the Electoral College, there was definitely this kind of sense of this was a fluke. We represent the way that America should be, and we will continue fighting, exhausting every single legal avenue, and we have the people with us. That was very much not the case this time. The Democrats just straight up lost. They lost the popular vote. They lost in many swing states, and they're really feeling that. And so as they're kind of going through this soul searching of what was wrong with our message. Do we stand for the things that the American people stand for? It was a much more kind of resigned and introspective kind of mood, as opposed to this, let's rally our arms and, sharpen the pitchforks and resist to the Trump administration as much as humanly possible.
Yeah, there was a protest on the National Mall on Friday or Saturday that I didn't actually know about until I had picked up a copy of the Washington Post. It was, I think, far, far smaller than the kind of protests you saw 8 years ago. The only Democrat I saw all weekend was Henry Cuellar, actually, who was also, probably the most moderate Democrat in the delegation. I think a lot of them sort of made the decision to get out of town for the weekend, or at least keep a very low profile. But I completely agree. I think, I think in some ways it feels a little bit more, it's less shocking. It feels a little bit normal for Democrats to have Trump as a president. I think there's also just a lot of soul searching about how they handled things last time, how the general, more broad electorate reacted to it, and whether it's maybe smarter to not sort of freak out about every single thing that happens and sort of, keep your powder dry for the fights that you really feel like are going to be meaningful for you and your constituents.
And we've seen some of that already with some of these immigration bills that are moving through Congress. I think we'll probably expect to see that a lot more, and maybe picking their shots a little bit. But I do want to just get into it. Let's talk about what was said during the speech. He talked about immigration, remain in Mexico is back, although weirdly he's also ending asylum, so hard to reconcile how that works. Talked about energy, we're going to drill, baby, drill. And he also talked about the Gulf of Mexico, Mars, and the Panama Canal. Eleanor, from an outsider's perspective,
okay.
What surprised you? What stood out?
I mean, I think, this isn't necessarily a surprise, but I think, it certainly stood out, I assume, to all of us listening to, the name recognition that President Trump gave our governor, Greg Abbott, right? I mean, certainly a big boost to Texas, to what Texas has been doing on immigration. It really felt like, a validation for a lot of what Texas has been doing, which, again, not a shocker, but I'm sure felt good to Abbott and some other folks in the, sort of Texas Republican elite.
Yeah, it was interesting on the border stuff. It was big shout out to Abbott,
Yeah.
as you mentioned. It was we're going to build wall fast, which is sort of what Abbott has already been doing, and we did declare a national emergency on the border in order to send military, which is sort of what Abbott did in Texas too. It was really sort of like an adoption from the national perspective of what Texas has been doing for the last 4 years.
And this has always sort of been the thing, right? Like when Democrats are in DC, Texas in many ways becomes like the government in exile for Republicans, right? Like Texas is like trying stuff. Texas is leading, I mean, just as the largest red state, like trying things in the court, certainly trying things on the border, since we have a significant stretch of border. And it's like now the political power has shifted and DC is back in the hands of Republicans, and we're sort of seeing those ideas that have been tested here go national.
Matthew, what did you see? Did anything surprise you? It felt like most of it was stuff that he had already talked about on the campaign trail.
Yeah, I mean, he was remarkably consistent. He was also very on script during his speech, which, for folks who have watched a lot of his speeches, realize that's a bit of a rarity sometimes. But what was kind of interesting, I thought, was, the reactions afterwards. It was much more muted and much more kind of, oh, this is just kind of just the norm now. Even though some of his proposals are extremely divergent from the norms, everything from renaming Denali to Mount McKinley to ending birthright citizenship, which is essentially just him challenging the Supreme Court to defy him. So we saw a lot of, not only in the coverage but also a lot of the response from some of the from the Democratic lawmakers. It was a lot of exhaustion. There's just not much more gas in the tank to kind of repeat the same message they've been saying for the past 8 years now.
One of the things that I'm curious about in the second Trump administration is sort of, in the first one, there was these hopes from even some of his supporters that after he won the election, he would become more quote unquote presidential. Mm-hmm. I don't think that anybody is holding their breath that will happen this time around. And in fact, we saw him hit the ground running. He's got an executive order on birthright citizenship. He's pardoned a lot of the people who were either prosecuted or in the process of being prosecuted for the January 6th attacks on the Capitol. So I'm just sort of curious, what kind of Trump do we think we'll see this time around? Because he talked a lot about these things like ending birthright citizenship, which are very important to his base, and sending the troops down to the southern border. But he's also talked about things like what we were just saying, renaming Mount Denali, Mount McKinley, the Gulf of Mexico, stuff that just seems kind of so off the wall. What are we expecting to see in this Trump administration, or should we expect to see everything?
I think, it's a common thing among liberals to sort of mock the media for being like, Trump has changed, or, what's the running joke? Like, on this day, he actually became president, or whatever like that. And, I think there's some truth to that mocking, right? Like, I think to expect him to behave particularly differently from his first term is probably a fairly unreasonable expectation. The one thing that I wonder about is what has really changed is how people are reacting to him, right? And that goes from the business community, which was very reluctant to engage with him, very, very reluctant to compliment him, very reluctant to to act like they were working with him in the first year. That sometimes meant that they incurred his wrath and upset him.
And you've got people like Musk, Zuckerberg,
Right.
Bezos at the...
Yeah, and they're all showing up at the inauguration. They're donating money to the inauguration. They're saying very nice things to him. I mean, I thought the TikTok message. Did you see this when TikTok shut down and they put on their little notice like, we're grateful to President Trump for like saying he's going to work back, and they credited him after that. But
there are legitimate national security concerns around TikTok.
Yeah, right. And even just the way the Democrats are reacting of like, I think what they would describe as like trying not to take the bait. And I mean, it's clear that one thing that sometimes motivated Trump in his first term was sort of reacting to how people react to him. They would anger him, or they would, he seems to relish a fight. And like, if this strategy sticks for Democrats, if they can sort of try to keep the temperature down, if the business community and other folks do that, will that just create a different dynamic for the presidency this year? That's one thing I'm curious to see.
Another thing that that really needs to be mentioned is just the difference in staffing that he has around him this time. I mean, last time he started with a very kind of diehard, but not exactly experienced in government team. And so he filled in a lot of that gap of experience by having people who weren't exactly really, really kind of committed to his cause, but had a lot of experience working in Republican politics, and that was a source of a lot of tension. This time he has a much more professional team. Susie Wiles, as chief of staff, really kind of transformed his campaign into a very, very disciplined, tight ship that was very effective, and a lot of that kind of professionalism is going to be translated into but filled or really, really kind of ideologically committed to what he stands for.
Okay, let's take a brief break to thank our sponsors. Mexico, more than just a neighbor. For timely cross-border insight, turn to former U.S. Ambassador Antonio Garza. Learn more at tonygarza.com. And we're back. Of course, so one of the big things that we saw people vote on this election was the economy. During the campaign, Trump promised to fix the economy and reverse a lot of Biden policies. Since the election, he sort of walked back and said, it's kind of hard to change grocery prices, something that many people could have told him before, but that he's got that bombast about him. So, and he's also talked about tariffs with Canada and Mexico and with other nations. I think some of the executive orders that he's planning are around tariffs to Canada and Mexico already. What is that going to do for our economy here in Texas, particularly with our relationship with Mexico, which is one of our top trading partners?
I think that this is an area where there is maybe not perfect alignment between our Republican leaders in the state and the Republican leaders in the federal government. And I'll go back to this business conference that Matthew and I both attended and sat in on. There was a national security panel featuring multiple members, current and former members of Congress, who were Republicans sort of dancing around the issue, saying, we're not sure that these basically what Trump has said is that he's going to impose a 25% across the board tariff on the U.S. and Mexico. On Canada and Mexico. And he said yesterday, I believe, that he's going to put that into effect on February 1st. And, this was before he said that on the inauguration, but folks saying, well, he's a really strong negotiator. And like what we really like to see here is that he's being tough with these countries and other international countries in the way that Biden wasn't. And that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to see 25% tariffs. It's just, this is the opening to a negotiating conversation. And I think that there was some, real concern or reluctance about like what the impact of that will be. Texas and Mexico are huge trading partners. The biggest kind of international port in the country is Laredo now because of goods coming up through Mexico. And it would be, it would be naive to say that that's not going to have an impact at all on jobs in Texas and also on prices for Texans and beyond if those things go into effect. I think it's interesting that he did not, you went down that list of executive orders he signed. He did not sign an executive order on tariffs for Texas and Mexico yesterday. He said he's going to in a month, or I guess less than a month, which does seem to show that there might be a possibility of wiggle room. But I think, a lot of leaders in Texas, whether it's business leaders or even political leaders, are maybe hoping that they can kind of bring these two countries to the negotiating table, extract some concessions, perhaps around border security. Trump has talked about this being related to the amount of fentanyl that's making its way across the border, the amount of undocumented immigrants who are making their way across these borders, and if they can come up with something that maybe those tariffs can be avoided.
Yeah, I think one important point is, that nod he made to Greg Abbott, and Greg Abbott is a big business guy.
Yeah.
He is a super business friendly governor. And then I think some of our congressional Republicans would you just think about people like Senator Cornyn.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to damage that relationship between Texas and Mexico, which is very fruitful for both sides. So I want to kick it to Matthew, who I know covers the relationship between the congressional Republicans and the president and the White House. So what do you see there, Matthew? I mean, is there wiggle room for these Republicans to, get in President Trump's ear and say, hey, maybe let's rethink this? Or, it's a promise that he's made, and he is not one to back down on promises.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to mention about the tariffs is that independent of the diplomatic consequences of them, I mean, this would impact consumers pretty directly because producers offload the cost of tariffs onto their consumers, so basically raising prices to match, and so that would have a direct consequence on Americans. And the members of our delegation contain some of the most ardent pro-Trump people. I mean, you would be hard-pressed to find somebody who adores Trump more than, someone like Congressman, like Ronnie Jackson, who's his physician, or Troy Nehls, who wore a T-shirt with with Trump's face printed on it into the House floor. So, you definitely have your diehards, kind of ride or die folks in there. That said, I mean, Texas business community is enormous. It has an incredible footprint on politics, the oil and gas industry in particular. And many of our members, including in the Republican delegation, are quite close with them. So there is certainly, and they certainly have, their own channels to communicate their displeasure with certain proposals, and they have used these with the president. That doesn't mean, going publicly against him. So I think Trump does have this kind of elegant exit if he wants to not impose these by so many people in his orbit saying that this is a negotiating tactic. It remains to be seen if he actually uses that. But even if he doesn't, even if he does use that exit, something that Congressman Cuellar brought up during this business conference I thought was really interesting was the idea of an uncertainty tax, that even if the tariffs are not implemented, businesses in his town of Laredo, which is the largest port of entry on the Texas-Mexico border, have already started freezing their activity in anticipation of a potential tariff, because they don't want to set up the infrastructure, set up the skeletal structure for a business deal that might get impacted and take that gamble. So even if it's not implemented now, the consequences are still being felt today.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, I think in the tech world, which obviously Trump is now working much more closely with, there is this idea of fail fast, try things, fail, and move on to the next thing. And I think we have seen in the first Trump administration sort of that mentality of try stuff and see what happens. The problem, as Matthew just pointed out, is the stakes are so high when you're talking about something like the U.S. economy, right, or tariffs. Companies are responsive even to just what the president says, even if it never happens. And so I think it's looking back, there was so much that happened in the first Trump administration just based on a tweet he sent or something that he said that had repercussions that are sort of hard to, we so rarely look back on what actually went into effect and what was the impact versus what was just talked about and how did that have an impact. So even just this talk about tariffs.
Yeah, and the chaos that comes with it.
Yeah, right.
I also think it's just important to point out that the sort of conversation around tariffs has really changed through the rise of Trump, right? 10, 15 years ago, there was this sort of broad consensus really shared by leaders in both parties that tariffs were not something that they wanted to see happen, that free trade was really the best policy for economic policy going forward. And I think Trump's election in 2016, one of the things that it revealed was that kind of consensus was not shared necessarily by voters around the country in the way that it was in Washington. And so Trump comes in, he implements some tariffs. People, when that happened, are kind of like, whoa, this is a big deal. This is crazy. But then, Trump leaves office, Biden comes into office and keeps a lot of those tariffs in place, right? And so, I think there is some hoping that this is a negotiating ploy. We'll see. I don't know. But I think maybe there are some people who are maybe wanting to go back to that free trade consensus in Washington and might be surprised that we might not go back that way. And if that's true, Texas could be fairly uniquely impacted by that just due to the proximity to the border and the impact that trade has on our economy.
I want to go to another point that piggybacks off of what Eleanor was talking about in terms of like the chaos that his sort of edict by tweet can throw us into, which is immigration and like how difficult it can be to pull off big things. We saw with when there was kids in cages in El Paso, we saw that. And I want to go to Matthew Choi because there's been talk about the massive deportation that Trump plans. And, he's set things on the campaign trail. He's already moving on them. I don't think there's any reason to think that this won't go into effect. But I want to touch on a thing that happened, which was this sort of infighting between some congressional Republicans that you covered about how quickly we're going to move on that, who we're going to prioritize. And sort of, I think that speaks to how difficult this might be and how chaotic it might be. Do you want to weigh in on this, Matthew, and sort of fill us in on which way you think it's going to go?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that needs to be kept in mind is that the number of undocumented immigrants in this country is colossal. It's over I believe 11 million now. 11 million is more than the population of the entirety of New York City. Could you imagine just removing all of New York City? It is an enormous enterprise that will require billions and billions of dollars of resources that federal law enforcement just don't have at their disposal. I mean, Trump did say that he wants to use the National Guard, but even with that, just the bureaucracy of verifying people's legal status will be an incredibly expensive undertaking. So there is a lot of divisions among Republicans about should we prioritize violent criminals or should we just kind of go after everybody? And that was kind of the divide there. But I think like the bigger kind of conflict really that's going to arise is how this squares with Trump's desire to cut federal spending so much with the implementation of this new Department of Government Efficiency, which is a kind of made by edict entity, trying to find ways to cut where that doesn't touch the Republican kind of third rails of Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, law enforcement, immigration enforcement. I mean, that's like a lion's share of federal spending. So, trying to amp up this operation while also trying to cut spending is going to be a huge debate for the next couple of years.
Matthew, do you have any sense of which way it's going to go? Whether President Trump is going to win out in the end and it's just going to be a free for all, like let's just deport everyone, or there's going to be a more targeted approach?
I mean, with the legislation that we've seen so far, it seems like they're targeting more people who have been convicted of criminals. I mean, it's worth noting that people who are convicted of criminals are already, first in line to be deported. So yeah, a lot of this is kind of politics, but that seems to be kind of where the will has been among Republican lawmakers. It's kind of to be seen if the White House is going to follow through on that. I mean, Stephen Miller, who's one of Trump's top domestic policy people, he is pretty ardent for all undocumented immigrants must be deported regardless. So it's to be seen which side will win out.
You remember, of course, many activists for immigrants' rights called President Obama the deporter in chief, right? As he really increased the number of deportations during his administration as a part of an effort to try to bring Republicans to the table for immigration reform going forward. And the way that he really did that was through, not your like immigration raids on workplaces or things like that, but through the criminal justice system, working with local governments and states, for people that are already sort of interacting with law enforcement, which I think is just a much, it's easier to sell to the public doing that, and B, it's just much easier logistically, right? Like, I know there was some reporting about the Trump administration possibly doing some kind of raids in the Chicago area, and then they perhaps pulled back on that after word leaked. I would not be surprised at all if you see some of that. But in order to really increase the numbers of people you're removing from the country, the logistics of that is just really challenging. And if you're the most efficient way to do that is not to, send ICE agents out in the streets.
I think that you guys possibly are being too optimistic about this. I think President Obama did it that way because he also was trying to advance immigration legislation. Here, President Trump doesn't want to advance any type of immigration legislation that would open up paths to citizenship. He wants to get people out of the country. And so I think we should be prepared for at least some chaos when it comes to these massive deportations that he's promised.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's probably, like, he and Stephen Miller and others are going to want to be able to point to enforcement actions
100%.
That will probably get a lot of news and get a lot of attention for sure.
Right. Okay. We've talked a little bit about the relationship between Texas and the federal government in a second Trump administration. Eleanor, I want to come to you because when there are Democrats in the White House, Texas becomes sort of the resistance, I guess. The true conservative leader, and they're suing the Obama administration, particularly the attorney generals.
The Biden administration.
I'm sorry, the Biden administration.
Well, actually, both, yeah. First Obama, then Biden.
First Obama, then Biden. Attorney General Greg Abbott did it. Then Ken Paxton followed in that. They are constantly talking about it. They're constantly sending news releases about their latest lawsuit. I think even up until the last day, Ken Paxton was sending emails about his last lawsuit against the Biden administration. What happens to the Attorney General's office here in Texas now that theoretically they are in line with the federal government? And what does that open them up to do, or how does that change that office?
Yeah, I mean, Attorney General Ken Paxton has been very proud of the fact that he has sued the Biden administration over 100 times and has really sort of set himself up in the media as like the litigator in chief against the Biden administration's priorities. When we saw the transition from Obama to the first Trump administration, Texas did still bring some lawsuits against certain policies, more like holdover policies from the Obama administration. But I think, that energy, the like political litigation energy that was being directed at the Biden administration, we're now going to see, certainly that doesn't go on ice now. I think it gets directed in new and perhaps like entirely unprecedented ways, right? I mean, we're already seeing lawsuits against nonprofits in Texas, like, some that help migrants at the border. We're seeing lawsuits against individual doctors, for allegedly providing gender-affirming care, or a doctor in New York for allegedly providing abortion pills to people in Texas. Like, I think we're going to see that, a lot of lawyers get recruited here from sort of this conservative legal infrastructure because they want to take on, aggressively political litigation. And if you're not going to direct that at what the presidential administration is doing, you're going to find somewhere to direct that energy. So I think we're going to see in the next 4 years a real explosion of litigation from that office that, again, we're going to, like the first Trump administration, like wear out the term unprecedented.
I'm really interested to see whether Ken Paxton's efforts against technology companies continue.
Yeah.
I was just scrolling through my email. January 9th, Ken Paxton sued TikTok. In December, he launched an investigation into TikTok and other companies. He sued TikTok in October as well.
There's an ongoing lawsuit against Meta as well.
Right.
And some of these lawsuits are actually good lawsuits. Like this is a I think that TikTok lawsuit that you're referencing is for TikTok advertising that they are safe for kids, which obviously we know not to be true from like a lot of the social media studies that there have been.
Yeah.
And the Meta lawsuits are also, I think, very thoughtful lawsuits.
Well, he won, over $1 billion in a settlement from Meta from a prior lawsuit as well. Yeah, and that has been a big part of the Ken Paxton playbook, is to file these suits against technology companies. But that was during a time where Republicans have been very hostile to technology companies. You know, we've already seen that start to shift. It'll be interesting to see whether that shifts in Texas as well.
Yep.
For sure.
Final thing that I want to talk about, we can't leave this week's podcast without talking about abortion. Yesterday on Monday, we reported on the passing of Cecil Richards, which is a big moment in Texas. I think also I just want to talk about, where does abortion go under a second Trump presidency, especially in the light of Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick this weekend telling Jason Whiteley at WFAA that he's perhaps open to changing the language on abortion or anti-abortion laws in the state. And then so this becomes a state versus federal thing. Should we expect it to continue to be a state versus federal thing? I want to get Eleanor and Matthew on this.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start just briefly by addressing Cecil Richards, like you said. She was the longtime head of Planned Parenthood, also daughter of former Texas Governor Ann Richards. She passed away on Monday after a battle with brain cancer. In writing her obituary, was going through some of her social media, and she had this tweet the day that Trump won his second election, where she said, people, to paraphrase her, she's like, people who do the sort of work that we do know, like, you lose, and then you win, which is, sort of, frankly, where the abortion access movement is in Texas, right? Like, they've lost a lot in the last couple of years. That's also where Republicans were, and sort of anti-abortion folks were for 50 years, right? They were losing, and then under President Trump, they got this huge win. They got the thing they wanted, which was, the Supreme Court justices that they needed to overturn Roe v. Wade.
Which is something he sort of avoided during the election.
Yeah, I mean, I think where do you go with that now is like a much messier question, right? Like if you give, the one thing many people, everyone in the anti-abortion movement agreed on was like Roe v. Wade needs to be overturned. President Trump made that happen. The next steps are a little bit, I think, people are less cohesive on what those next steps should be. As you mentioned, even within Texas, like sort of, you could argue like the leading state for anti-abortion laws and litigation. This weekend, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick said, he would be open to clarifying the existing abortion laws to ensure that doctors feel safe treating women with complicated pregnancies. That is not, if that happens, and we should note that Senator Brian Hughes, who authored the law, came out and said he'd be open to talking about that. We heard some stuff from House members as well. If that happens, that is certainly not going to be a repeal of these laws, right? Like, Texas will remain a state where abortion is banned. They clarify that language to sort of leave doctors feeling more empowered to treat complicated pregnancies. We're talking incremental changes.
Yeah, I'm noticing a big hesitation on your or skepticism. You keep saying if you don't seem convinced that it's going to move forward.
I mean, I think Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick saying anything is more than we've heard in a long time on this.
And he lays out sort of what the agenda is in the Senate.
Right.
Like, so, what is possible to pass.
Right. So, I mean, certainly, could we see this get talked about more than it did last session? Absolutely. Could we maybe even see some clarifying? I mean, we saw a bill last session that went really under the radar, where it sort of gave doctors affirmative defense if they treated, if they terminated a pregnancy to treat sort of specific conditions, which was heralded as sort of this we did something, we clarified these laws a little bit, and doctors have said, offering us an affirmative defense, which says if we get sued, if we face criminal charges, then you can defend yourself, is not enough to free them up to practice medicine the way they want to. And I'll say, before the last session, Governor Greg Abbott said, if we need to clarify these laws, we will, and nothing happened. So I wouldn't say skeptical. I would say I'm standing by for more information.
Matthew, let's close it out with you. Like I said, during the election, President Trump sort of sidestepped a lot of these questions about abortion and potential national abortion bans. It becomes, again, he said we're going to leave it to the states. So it becomes, again, a state versus federal thing. Should we expect any movement on abortion from the federal government, from a Trump administration?
Yeah, they haven't really indicated that so much. I mean, the official kind of line from the Trump camp has always been like, this is the state's issue, so let's let the states decide. And just in terms of the kind of political play of it, Republicans throughout the cycle have indicated that defending their bans on abortion is not a winning political issue in any of the polling or focus groups they've done. They'll also say on the other side that Democrats had way too much confidence in campaigning off of abortion, and that's the reason why they did so poorly in several key elections, including in Texas. But I mean, without that kind of strong political will, and also such a large agenda list to do with reconciliation this year, we haven't really seen that much momentum on the national front for a national ban.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. That's going to do it for this edition of the TribCast. Thanks to Eleanor. Thanks to the Matthews. Please send us pictures of you in your boots and bow ties. Join us again next week, and please follow, like us, subscribe to our podcast so that we can keep doing this thing. Thank you to our sponsors, former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, Antonio Garza. Our producers are Rob Avila and Chris Svoboda. Our theme music is composed by Rob. See you next week.